Topic 4 is where we get into some new stuff that we haven't really done yet. You can have functions with variable parameter lists. Up till this point, all of the functions, when you declared them, said, I need exactly one input parameter, or two input parameters, or three input parameters, but you've never had one where you can send it a varied number of input parameters until now. So I think I just said that. So here's an example where this function is called getUserInfo, and it has a prompt input parameter. But you can see I have said prompt equals tell me your first name. This is a default for that input parameter. And what happens here is if you call getUserInfo without any kind of input parameter, it's just going to assume that you want prompt to be tell me your first name. So that allows you to send it nothing. However, if you send it a different thing, like tell me your last name, which I'm going to do here shortly, then it will use that as prompt's value. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that. You can see here's my function. All it does is it takes the input and returns it. So here I'm going to actually utilize that function. So I'm going to say user first name is variable, and I'm going to call getUserInfo, but I'm not going to send it any data. So we are going to, or any input parameter. So we're going to assume that prompt is tell me your first name. And then I'm going to set up user last name. And this time I'm going to override the default for prompt and say I want it to be tell me your last name. So then it will run the function, but prompt will be tell me your last name. And then I'm going to print the two outputs just to show you they're different. So I'm going to say that, and you can see the first time I ran the function, my prompt was tell me your first name. The second time I ran the same function, it says tell me your last name. So then I was able to utilize the exact same function in two different ways by overriding that default prompt. Maybe in most cases you have something that 90% of the time it has a specific value. You would want to create a default for that so you don't have to send it every time. But then once in a while you have a weird case where you need to send something different. In that case, you can override that default. You can also have multiples. So I just showed you one. In some cases, you can have more than one. The thing here is that you need to make sure that you have your defaulted input prompts as the last prompts, because otherwise it doesn't know which one you're assigning to which. So you can see here I've created a couple of functions here. The first one says check inputs, and this function checks to make sure that the user inputs are either true or false. And if it checks and says, hey, if it's not in this list, true or false, return E, which is essentially an error in this case. So that's all that function does. This function is allowing you to set up your alarm clock. Now, it's not a real alarm clock. It's just setting a couple of values that you could utilize for an alarm clock. And I've got my pep strings here that we were talking about a little while ago. Or actually, I don't. No, actually, I don't. This is just information about this function. So what this does, first it says, hey, if I send this input parameter buzz right here, see, if buzz equals E when I send it to this other function, or if check inputs is AM right here, is sent to this function errors, then I want to return a value error. So I'm essentially what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, if the person sending the input parameters doesn't send me true or false, then we just need to drop out of the function because there's an error here. So that's just a quick check for input validation. Then, if everything's fine, then we continue on and says, hey, if AM equals true, morning, night, the variable I made, becomes AM. Otherwise, morning, night becomes PM. So essentially, if the input parameter is true, then I want it to be an AM alarm clock. Otherwise, I want it to be a PM alarm clock. And I set AM as the default because in most cases people want an alarm clock in the morning, but sometimes maybe they want one in the evening. And then the next if is if buzz equals true, then I'm going to assign will buzz, you will be woken with a buzz, otherwise you will be woken with a tone. So it's letting the user choose whether they want a buzz alarm clock or a tone alarm clock. And then I'm going to I do it within my function here, which probably isn't fantastic, but I print output saying this is all the choices you made, and I also print whether you'll be woken with a buzz or a tone. Now the things to point out here, again, I've got 4 input parameters on this function, but 2 of them have default values. So I can send just 2 input parameters and it will work. And it will just assume that the other two are accepting the default. Or I can send 3, and it will take my inputs and then assume that AM is the default parameter. The thing I need to note here is you cannot send it hour wake, minute wake, and AM without sending buzz unless you specifically state the variable name. I think I do that on the next cell here. So we're going to go ahead and run this function now. So I've got it created. On the next slide, I'm going to first set up my alarm clock for 6:55 a.m. or 6:55 a.m. Or AM equals false, so that'd be in the evening, and then using a tone, and then I'm going to run the thing again, and you can see the second alarm clock is for 7:45 a.m. and you'll be woken up with a tone because I said buzz equals. There we go. Okay, so I had them in the wrong order here, but in this case now it's saying you will be woken up with a buzz.